Okay, we're a little bit late here. Still waiting for one more maintainer to show up. He will be here. In fact, he's here. Welcome to the BoF. I'm glad you all showed up. I'm Frank Rowand. I'm one of the device tree maintainers. We also have Grant Likely and Rob Herring. Grant's pretending he's not a maintainer. He's still in the maintainer's file. He's in the process of retiring. Mark Rutland is not in the room. He's a binding maintainer. We have other people who you tend to send device tree patches to, like Olaf, who's in the front. So subsystem maintainers take device tree binding patches. And there are a lot of people here who are experts in device tree in general. Here's our agenda. I'm not going to stick on the slide because we are short on time for the amount of information we have to cover. The first thing I'd like to do is, if you have any preconceived questions, thoughts, concerns that you want to ask about, we'll take them down and make a quick list and try to get back to them later, or anytime through the evening you can blurt out your great concerns and let us know what they are. Did anybody come in with a burning question they want answered?
No, you can put it down on the list.
Okay.
Include files and cross-tree dependencies.
So that was include files and cross-tree dependencies. Anything else real quick? Going, gone. Yes. So that's
dealing with incomplete device. We need to figure out how to deal with incomplete devices.
so is that at the build time, at the boot time? Okay, the hardware might be missing something. Okay. I want to go over a little bit of history. There was a session, there may be a session in Plumbers 2016 this coming fall in Santa Fe that's in concert with the Kernel Summit. This session is not approved yet, but it's looking good that it probably will be accepted. So just give you a heads up if you want to show up for that. And also, if you want to add topics, there's a current agenda, which is really just a placeholder agenda, areas of interest. These slides will be on the conference website afterwards. They're not there yet. And you can email me if you want to add stuff also. There was a session at Plumbers last year, and I'm not going to go into details here, but mostly point out that the information is on the web. Some of the slide sets are there on the elinux.org website, and there was an Etherpad notes taken during the session. And we covered a lot of issues. One is the binding document and device tree source validation. And that's kind of stalled right now. Hopefully that'll pick up again later this year. It's a rather important endeavor, I think. There was a lot of talk about the DTC compiler. The DTC compiler maintainers are very open to patches, fixes, improvements, and we've seen some movement in that direction this year. Pentelis will be talking about overlays some more today. Probe ordering was talked about a bit. You've probably seen that on the kernel mailing list over the last 2+ years. Several abortive attempts to deal with that, and we talked about that a little bit, and it's still not resolved. Next, we'll have Grant talking about a new initiative that he's working on. So it's all yours, Grant. No, didn't get them. Do you have USB?
I don't. Did anyone got a? Do you have display ports? Anyone have a? Do you have a display port adapter? To the one you had on the. Thank you. That's not very promising. Okay, Plan B. Kent, did you have your? It's not even checked against. Hold on. Yeah, thumb drive. Do you have it on your laptop, Kanta? We'll do it from there. No, nothing. So I've got it on the VGA. Do you have it there? There we go. Oh, there we go. Go to view percent. I think that'll do it. Yeah, view. There we go. Yay! Okay, so now that we spent 5 minutes going through this, I'm out of time, so I'll talk about this later. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Grant Likely, and we've been working on a project. Kanta, stand up again. I've been working with Kanta Beccaraya on putting together a specification process for device tree. So this has been a long time coming. I've avoided it for a very long time because it was potentially a lot of work, and yes, it is a lot of work. But it's coming together now. We've started looking at the details of what exactly is going to be needed to start a specification process. And what I'm presenting now is kind of where we've gotten to. We've been very quiet about this so far because most of the work has just been figuring out what needs to be done. Now we're ready to talk about it, and we're able to kind of make a proposal on what we think the structure will be for doing a formal specification. It's taking over where EPAPR left off. So I'll flip through this. This is the same set of slides that I presented in Bangkok a few weeks ago. I'll go through this fairly quickly because a bunch of this material you already know, and I can talk about it more. I don't want to take up the whole session. So the goal is we want to pick up where EPAPR left off. And so EPAPR, the last release of EPAPR was 5 years ago. It was PowerPC specific. We've all moved on from there. There's a bunch of bindings that are core that we use now that aren't described in EPAPR. So we need a place to put that. One of the reasons that we want to do that, I mean, we've been doing it in the kernel tree. We've been documenting all this stuff, but there's other groups that want to use it, such as U-Boot, such as BSD, and UEFI and different projects. So our goal was to create a process, to create an organization to govern the process, and we wanted to make sure that we were doing a new style specification where we were open, transparent, and collaborative. So I've already mentioned that we need to replace EPAPR. We want to have a formal document where we're actually doing proper review for the core bindings. So we want to capture the stuff we're already doing, such as GPIOs and clocks and regulators. We're going to need to capture how to do overlays and standardize how to do that. And we want to be able to coordinate with the new tooling that Frank has already mentioned that we're needing. So what we're proposing to create a new organization, and we're calling this organization devicetree.org. The purpose of this organization would be to govern the process and licensing around a new document that would be published periodically by this organization and would have a regular cadence that we get new features into. We are proposing an organization that's funded by membership, that has a steering committee that is focused on the governance decisions, so that's things such as when to publish the document, what the makeup of the steering committee is, what content will be in each release. And we're proposing an organization that's going to be hosted by Linaro. However, the goal is for this organization to be as light as possible. We don't want to lock a bunch of the decision-making process behind a steering committee. We want to continue to operate the way we already are in the Linux kernel community. So our mantra is open by default. The plan is to use open mailing lists. We're already using the device tree mailing list on kernel.org. We are proposing that participation does not require membership in any way, shape, or form. We still do what we do. We post to the mailing list. We post our contributions with a DCO process. And we're proposing a developer-friendly workflow. The old ePapper documents were stuck in a Word document, and I'm pretty sure very few people in this room want to be hacking on Word. So our plan is to use regular markup. We're looking at ASCII Doctor as the planned markup. And the process for actually contributing is patches to the mailing list. Review, comments to patches on the mailing list. Oops, I was too slow. There we go. Okay. So that's the plan. We've gone through, we've looked at what the details are going to be and how much work it's going to, well, what needs to be done to make it happen. And so we've got a proposed timeline as well. We've broken it down into 3 phases. Right now we're in phase 1, and this is very much figure out what it is that we have to do. We're planning to be finished that by about May, and there's 2 things that we're doing in parallel with this. One is that we're working on the content. We've got a copy of ePapper. We're working on relicensing ePapper. So we've got the governance side of figuring out all the things that need to be done to release a new document that's based on ePapper. And then the second part is the technical. And that is, there's a few of us that we've created an interim committee with that we're looking through the technical content and figuring out what we need to do. We should be finished that around May, beginning of May this year. And then we're going to be able to open up, we'll be able to publish it because the document will be open. Then we're going to be looking at trying to actually bring in members for the new organization. We'll take 4 months to kind of get through that, get the cadence of the next release of the document, and then finally in phase 3, we expect to have the organization completely running independently on running as its own organization. So to break it down a little bit, as I said, we're in phase 1 right now. We've set up a small interim committee. So Kanta, Rob, and I are on it from Linaro. We've got Charles and Mark from ARM. Stuart Yoder, who was the original ePapper editor, is on the committee. And we've got a couple of people from IBM, Jeff Scheel and Stuart Smith. We've pretty much got an agreement that Linaro will host, so far their feedback has been okay with Linaro hosting this organization, but it is still running separately. We're not having this be a Linaro project. It's a separate project that Linaro happens to be hosting. We're working on the license of the document, getting ePapper released, and we're setting up the web presence. So devicetree.org that I currently own is going to be moved over to new hosting. We're going to set up the content of devicetree.org, and basically all that it will be pointers to existing information as much as possible, plus hosting of the specification documents itself. As I said, we expect to be done, it says it says April there. I'm saying end of April, seeing as we're already in April. Next page. Phase 2, we'll be finalizing the details on the membership model. We'll be fleshing out more details on the actual form of the committee, and we'll be preparing for a second release in August. So at each of these release points, we will actually have a document that goes with it. And then we're going to be ready to actually do a press release and start soliciting or start asking for members of the organization. Next one. And then finally in phase 3, we expect to have a formal steering committee. We will have another release of the document. We're expecting December. We'll be able to also talk about it far more freely on the details at all the major conferences. By this time, I'm expecting, I mean, we're doing this from Lenaro's point of view right now. By this time, we're expecting that there will be representatives from any of the communities that care. That includes FreeBSD, U-Boot, UEFI, Zen, Open Power, anyone else who cares. Yep. So, what we're expecting to get in there. For the first release, we want to get the stuff that's missing from ePapper, which I've already talked about. By the second release, we want to start getting in some of the features that are still in progress, such as overlays, and need to be kind of finalized. We're talking about trying to get some of the schema language that that Matt Porter has been talking about, try to actually formalize that. And there's a couple of future features that have been talked about that will be on the table. Next. When we create the steering committee, it's going to be, again, very flat governance structure. There'll be a chair, a vice chair, a technical writer who's probably going to be supplied by Lenaro, and an administration role as well. And then we expect to have one seat on the steering committee for each member of the organization. Now, one of the questions that I keep getting is why do we have membership? What is the purpose of this? Is this closing this off to community developers or anything like that? The answer is no. The whole purpose of membership is to provide a little bit of funding and to there's some buy-in that comes along with it to have organizations join the organization. So as far as what the advantages of joining is, those who are on the steering committee are going to be able to have some influence over kind of what the release cycle is. I'm going to compare this with the UEFI process, where often the release cycle of UEFI is driven based on features of when people need releases. And we felt that that was a very sensible process. That doesn't mean that's the only place that influence comes from, but it's a seat at the table, and I think it's a good model to follow. But I cannot say this strongly enough. The membership participation does not require membership. We've been very, very clear about this right from the beginning. Anyone can contribute. It will be a completely open process in terms of you contribute on the mailing list, you discuss patches on the mailing list. You do not there's no special control over the technical content that comes from being a member of the organization. Membership fees, we're still trying to finalize the fees. It'll probably be on par with what the UEFI forum fees are, which is $2,500 a year. So, I mean, for most organizations, that's pocket change. But we also want to have the ability for individuals to sit on the steering committee. So, those of you who are individuals and feel that you're involved with the device tree, the core device tree bindings, and you want to be involved, please say so and come forward. If you do not have an organization that's that wants to join devicetree.org, come as an individual, and the individuals will be by invitation of the steering committee. We'll skip past that. There's a few open questions that we're coming in on an answer on. Contribution agreement is an important one. for cleanliness of the document. We are planning on using a DCO process just like the kernel and several other projects, as opposed to a CLA. The reason being, we don't want the added overhead of having to sign an agreement in order to contribute. DCO process is very well vetted. I think it works for this as well. And then we were going to release the document under Apache v2. That is what we are able to get the ePapper document relicensed under. So I'm completely comfortable with Apache v2. And we still are talking about when to bring in more interim committee members. Next one. And that's it. Yep. Okay. So that's what we're planning to do. This is very much the structural of what needs to happen in order for us to have a spec process. Right now, the committee is working on the detail, like getting the existing document in a form that's usable to be hacked on and start making changes to. But I'm expecting to be able to, once that's released, it'll be on GitHub. And you'll be able to clone it, make changes, generate the document. Questions?
I already have this written down, but in addition to individuals being invited to be on the committee, have you thought about having a just general representative of the community as one of the spots there?
That's a good idea. Yeah, so we already kind of have, I'm kind of expecting that. I mean, Rob's on the committee. I'm on the committee. Frank's asked to be on the committee. There's Mark's on the committee. I'm not worried about having good community representation.
Not overly worried either. Just wanted to put that out there.
You know, if it's, I would not have a problem having for the steering committee to have some officially recognized community representative role.
Yeah.
Sure. I'm not very precious about this process. Yeah. This is not a power play. This is about how do we get this done.
Exactly.
Any other questions? Wow, easy crowd. Okay, Olaf.
Technical steering committee, every member has a representative.
Correct.
Does that include individual membership? Is that going to be?
Well, individual if you're an individual member, by default, you're on the steering committee. So I'm not expecting every individual to be a member. In fact, I don't think that would be productive. We want a steering committee that works. And you don't have to be on the steering committee to have significant influence over the technical content. In fact, a position on the steering committee has no bearing on whether or not you are contributing to the technical content. The steering committee is about governance.
Is the steering committee on the escalation path in case of disagreements?
Yes, it's going to have to be.
But then there is a slight difference.
There is a slight difference. The question was, in the case of conflict, will the steering committee be the path of escalation? And yes, it will be. Laura. So the question is, will the committee be driving new features? We still have the same problem, as always, of we need people technically involved to do this. I think the steering committee, the process, socially, I think the process is going to help by the fact that we're going to be having a regular cadence of meetings and be talking about what needs to go in. The steering committee as a role does not officially help to create new content. But the steering committee as a group, I'm expecting to be the same people who are hacking on device tree already. And so I'm hoping that this will help to kickstart the technical process. They're going to be doing the job anyway.
you can submit features that you feel that should be going into the specification regardless through the mailing list. You can do that. Now, if there is a specific conflict or it doesn't quite fit into what you possibly may feel should go in the spec, but it may not quite fit into the spec, then that's something that the steering committee probably would go over and review. But in terms of being open to features, it's open.
That's a good question. The question is, how are we going to get all the bindings into this document? And the answer is we're not. So there's a boundary that we've decided to start with, and that is the specification document makes sense for everything that's core, all of the core bindings. So GPIO, regulators, clocks, overlays, anything that is core generic functionality makes sense to go into the spec. Device bindings, on the other hand, they're per device, and they're a little bit, they're all over the place. There's a little bit of a sense of it's okay for those to be a little bit of a Wild West on that. So for the specification, we're not going to put those in there. That said, there is a good argument to say that as we're in the process of doing this specification, perhaps we should create a parallel repository to start putting the device bindings in, so that it's out of the kernel tree, and we've got a process for documenting, and also pairing those up with the tooling for checking schemas. Yes, PinMux as well. I think the steering committee is going to need to provide some guidance on. It's a good question. Where exactly does the boundary need to be on what goes in and what does not? And I think that that's going to be one of the hot topics of discussion early on as we figure it out. That's a discussion that will happen on the mailing list. That's not a discussion that will happen in the steering committee privately. There needs to be a, yes. Yes. And I think that'll end up being captured. We've already talked about that a bit. So the suggestion was there should be a set of best practices of how to describe things and what should go in, what should be described and in what way.
So I don't know if I want to open this can of worms, but I will. So you and I have talked about not ABI, but having bindings progress from, device vendor specific to proposed core standard to ratified core standard, something along those lines. I was just wondering if the room had any comment or if they think that's a good idea or not.
As far as the spec is concerned, I think we've got enough things that enough things that are a mess that we've got to deal with that first. For the device bindings of how do we stabilize things over time, I don't know. We've not had an answer for that. We've not had a good answer for that as long as we've been discussing it. We've got some best practices on the way to do things so that you can rev forward. But there's how do you keep the documentation up to date, and how do you test to make sure drivers aren't doing bad things, or how do you test to make sure binding changes aren't happening? Part of the answer to that, I think, is tooling, and part of the answer to that is testing different combinations with kernel CI. So if we're going to do that, at what level do we care about backwards compatibility? At what level do we care about, we're going to fix the device tree and we're going to boot a newer kernel? So I think that's a separate discussion. Any others? Okay, Frank, I think I can hand it back to you. Thanks, Frank.
We are running really short on time, so I'm going to gloss over a lot of my content. I've given a few talks in the last year about some new tools that I've been prototyping and proof of concepting. And the latest talk was a 2-hour talk in ELC Europe. So I can go on and on and on. I'm not going to do that. I was just going to give a quick update, and I'm actually going to skip most of that update. The one concrete fact is I created a tool to diff 2 different DT files, whether they're source or binary or coming from the proc file system on your target. And that has been merged into RC1 of the latest Linux kernel. So that tool is now available with the new name. There are a couple of other tools. One to figure out what config variables you need for the Linux kernel to match a device tree. And hopefully I'll be submitting that patch soon. I've been working with that with another person, and that should be appearing soon. I have another prototype tool that's almost ready that looks at what properties are actually accessed on your target system versus what's in your device tree source. And that's an interesting debugging tool. I have another tool I talked about in the talks before. What's working and not working for a given device tree on your target system? What devices were created, not created? What drivers were bound or not? And there's about an hour's worth of talk discussing how to use this tool. And these are some examples. You can come find me for what these look like. We'll come back to Pintails in just a second. There are a few random things I just wanted to bring up. There's some new warnings available in the DTC tool that Rob added in. And there were how many warnings coming out of that?
For the ARM tree, 25,000. 2,500 of which were unique. And the ARM64 tree was just as bad, but there's fewer device trees, so it was a smaller number. So what's in there now is unit address without a reg property or vice versa. So there's various places to address that. There's maybe some that we whitelist, probably like memory node, to allow exception there. Then I'm also working on things like underscores and names, and there's several other characters that are allowed that we never use, like asterisks in names of nodes or properties, and as well as checking the reg value matches the unit address, and then some bus specific checks.
And I've forgotten whether you got the patch accepted to be able to optionally select this with the make.
Oh, so it's the warnings are off by default. It's in Linux Next now. The warnings are off by default and enabled with W=1 on the command line.
So we expect a lot of cleaned up device trees over the next year, hopefully. There are some changes needed in the device tree compiler for overlays to work, and hopefully that'll be progressing this year. There's a lot of code. This has come up in about 3 different threads recently on the mailing lists where the drivers or the core code can be looking across all nodes or all nodes available, where all nodes available is checking, is your node enabled or disabled? And that was really surprising to see that pop up all of a sudden. So we're going to be cleaning that up in the near future. I don't know what the fallout will be on that. Locking, we've known for years that it's really broken. It's not a practical issue right now. As soon as you want to do parallel driver instantiation where you're modifying the device tree, it will become an issue. It's potentially an issue for overlays. So that's going to get my attention this year, hopefully. there's something else I want to be thinking about this year. I really don't know what the answer is or where this is headed. Device tree is supposed to be describing the hardware. Reality is it does three things. It describes the actual hardware. There are places where it configures which hardware to use or how. And third is describing policy. And so that's a discussion I think we need to have this year and figure out, do we just keep doing this and say this is what we allow? Maybe is there some way we can identify which are the three different classes? I'm not sure where this is headed, but I'd love for people to be thinking about this in this year. And we're going to come back to Vintelis.
Sure, this is maybe this is last year.
You emailed, you emailed me the plumbers.
Yeah, that's last
Yeah.
year.
Yeah, that's where I got.
Okay.
Do you have a?
I did send you an update.
This is one that became.
Okay, just let me see. Probably after you sent it.
Yeah.
Okay, this is the old one.
Yeah. Do you have the thumb drive?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Are there any other questions and thoughts that came up? We're officially done right about now, but we'll keep talking as long as they don't kick us out. Oh, good. We still have officially 10 minutes, but again, we'll keep talking as long as people want to hang out. A question from Laura. Yeah, so the comment from Laura was it'd be great to get the whole configuration versus policy versus hardware description into the specification.
So there's one idea that I've been noodling about on is taking the device tree overlay idea and then coming up with a new binary format that will encode that. And the purpose of that is that firmware would be able to, instead of rewriting the device tree, append sections at the back of it. Now there's some tricky libFTT stuff that has to happen to make that work. But the upshot would be you'd be able to pass a blob with tag differences and you'd be able to identify what kind of changes those are. We would be able to specify, what kinds of changes go in there. And the other advantage to that is it becomes possible to have a hardware description that's either can be applied either by firmware or by, and so I'll give it to Vintelis, either by firmware or by or at runtime. One of the advantages if we do something that way is it also means that when we kexec into another kernel, we're not throwing away information. The next kernel would be able to choose which extensions it actually applies. Or kexec would be able to throw away things like the old kernel command line because it doesn't care anymore. Alan.
Another thing along those lines is if you're applying an overlay, and I've proposed a patch for overlay notifications so that whoever's handling the notification could reject the overlay, so that you apply an overlay, if it gets accepted, then it goes in the live tree, and then presumably the configuration's already happened and the live tree is actually describing what's really going on. And if it gets rejected, then you don't have something stale in your live tree that's something that didn't happen, that's not a configuration that's true. Okay, yeah, that's...
We've got all of the infrastructure there to, the changes are supposed to be applied as atomically as we can. So it is possible to, ahead of time, make the decision, am I going to apply this? And if not, back out.
The part that I added was not change set notifications, but overlay notifications, so the driver that's handling the notification could see the whole overlay instead of just each change that's coming through as it's being proposed. So it could get a full context of the whole overlay. That's on the list as of a couple of months ago. I did it for FPGA support of, yeah, okay.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about what's new on the device tree for 2016. That's a small list of, okay, it's okay. So what's new? So we have a patch for putting all the P handles in a hash table. Since now we have huge device trees and iterating over the P handles is taking some time. More? Okay. For overlays, we have extra indirect targets. A target route where you restrict the overlay only to apply in a subtree. We have changed helpers. Symbol propagation from loaded overlay so that you can load an overlay and then have another overlay refer to a symbol on the overlay that was loaded earlier. This is more because people have been hitting those corner cases, and we have an overlay manager for probable buses, which is an RFC, but we'll see how that goes. So a new modern device tree has probably hundreds of P handles, and the algorithm we use right now is just iterate over the full device tree to figure out what's going on, and that takes time. So we just use our hash table to put the P handles there. Just a very small patch, and it makes a big difference. We have indirect targets. So let's say you have an overlay that applies to different connectors, and you want to use the same overlay for all the compatible connectors that are available. So you need something to say, okay, this overlay applies to this target and this target and this target, and you have a list, and you can select with a function call there. So the ID is a property that contains the target in a target indirect node. We have target route. So if you want to apply an overlay to a device that's located on a probable bus, like a PCI or USB, so you need to apply it to a specific node in the tree, and that's how you do it. You restrict it to be applied only there. Chain set helpers. So we have chain sets, but they're very hard to use. So if you try to add a new property, it's going to be really hard because you have to allocate the property yourself and then fill out all the fields. While this API just makes it simple, and the property is dynamically allocated. Symbol propagation. So I just referred to that earlier. So if you have an overlay that defines a symbol, a label, then you have an overlay that's loaded afterwards to refer to it, and then it will just work like if it was in the main device tree. And finally, this is an RFC. If you have to apply an overlay to a probable device like USB or PCI, this is a way to do it. It dynamically generates device node and then applies an overlay according to criteria files that are in config.fs. Okay, good. Any questions?
overlays. And so what's the status? I mean, it's been around for like ages. So what?
No, but he's really, he's a nitpicker, so I need to get everything right. Anything else? Yeah, all the changes are available in my tree. And we have the portable connector, which I didn't, we have the portable connector stuff that I presented today. That's a pretty big discussion, so I know it's very early, but we'll see how that goes.
Question was, how is the config.fs interface going for overlays?
It works. I already have the patches for binary config.fs being accepted, so you need the one less patch now.
I am not the device tree maintainer anymore, but I don't want it merged. Not yet. But the reason for that is I think overlays are sufficiently scary in terms of what core kernel structures end up getting touched, that I really want it done per device or per bus, so that there's constraints on where nodes are going to actually be added and modified. So that's my position on that, but my opinion counts for less than it used to. I defer to the actual maintainers.
So I skipped over the debugging tools I've been working on pretty quickly. I would like to get feedback from anybody who's using them or can't use them, what's good about them, what's bad about them, what else you need that's not there. I'm not sure if I'll be giving more talks about those tools and where they're headed later this year, or if I'll be submitting other talks. But there's a very good chance that you will hear more talks from me on this subject at either LinuxCon Japan or ELC Europe LinuxCon, potentially plumbers. So I'd love to hear any issues people have and where their pain points are. We're officially done, so I think they're going to stop recording, but I'll be hanging out here. The other device tree maintainers, you can probably twist their arms to say a few more minutes. So thank you all for coming officially, and so we're officially done, but we'll stay here and keep talking.